The reality is that the geometry of our population, the structure of population distribution, was basically set probably in the 1860s. But within that, there's been quite a bit of change. There's been quite within that broad structure, and I think it is important not to see it as being static. Certainly not static. We move house more than anyone else, although most of that is counterbalancing and most of it is over a short area. We're getting a slight increase in concentration in the northern states and Western Australia, and a decline in New South Wales, South Australia, Tasmania, and a relative stability between rural and urban, although in recent years the proportion living in large urban areas has increased. In trying to depict the pattern of population change across the country, if you do a normal choropleth map, which geographers use to do this, two people moving house in central Australia can lead to this massive growth or decline across a very large area. So what I've done here is to take urban localities, and the red localities are ones which are growing and the green ones are ones which are declining. And what I think is pretty clear here is that we're getting two rural Australias. We're getting the coastal areas which are growing, and we're getting, particularly in the wheat sheep belt of southwestern Australia, southeastern Australia and southwestern Australia, a strong pattern of decline. So we're getting that very quite distinctive pattern of population change as well. So what is our demographic challenge? And this has, I think, been well considered in the intergenerational reports, in productivity commission reports, but basically what it is that while our population is growing, there is no growth occurring in the workforce, and the growth is very much concentrated in those older age groups. The gap between working population or working age population and dependent age population is declining. The implications for spending on health and ageing are very substantial, a doubling of the proportion of GDP that will need to be devoted to it by 2040, and increased fiscal pressure, the intergenerational report has indicated. So it's firstly that difference between the working and non-working population, but it's also the larger numbers of people moving into the older age groups. How do we meet those challenges? There's a number of strategies, and I think it's really important here that there is no silver bullet, just like there is in dealing with water. There's no single thing which is going to provide all the answers. There are things we can do among the baby boomer population. We can encourage them to work longer, increase their savings and for retirement. And one which I'm particularly interested in is actually doing something about health and obesity to reduce some of the health impacts later on. Other strategies for other working age groups: increased participation. Our participation levels are very low. Increased productivity. Then strategies in the health and aged care areas. But we need to retain the workforce at least at its current size, maybe marginally increase it in the short term. And this is part of the dilemma which I want to pose. On the one hand, the demography is such, and in looking at our whole economy and society, it seems to me that it's necessary for us to increase population, at least in the short and medium term, to take account of these pressures which the baby boom population is going to put on. If we turn to the environment, however, it's very clear that there are major constraints on population growth which are imposed by water and other environmental constraints. And I believe quite strongly that Australia should be working towards a situation where we have a stable population with a balance between older and younger populations, and one which is not growing, if we're going to be moving towards a sustainable Australia. So in the short and medium term we have to have growth, but I would argue that in the longer term we should be working towards a zero population growth situation. Now, water is very clearly the major limiting factor of population growth in Australia, and it's been recognised as such over a number of over a long period. There's certainly been some that have denied it, and I'm going to refer particularly to the state that I live in South Australia. There was a long period in South Australia, where the significance of water was absolutely denied. There was even a saying of the rain follows the plough, that as the agricultural land was extended north and it was extended beyond what was called Goyder's line, the line of 12 inches of rainfall, which was seen to be the limit for safe agriculture. But through the 1870s it was extended over that line, and then through the 1880s, through the droughts, a very considerable retraction of that line due to that overstepping of those limitations. Griffith Taylor, a geographer, was a very considerable advocate of the limitations that the environment placed on the expansion of population. In fact, rereading his work over the last couple of years, it is surprising how much of it is very, very opposite to the current situation. And he was one who argued that the environmental constraints, particularly water, basically set the alignments of the Australian population distribution in 1860, and they've been maintained. He produced a wonderful series of maps which indicate the limitations of particular areas for settlement. In the Borry Inquiry of 1973, there is a section which points out that water is the major limiting factor, and quotes the CSIRO that Australia is a very, very dry continent, part of our national ethos, and that water is the main factor limiting population distribution. And there were a number of inquiries through the 90s which pointed out this limitation of environmental constraints. But one of the things which it did point out too was that we know very, very little about that nature of those constraints. How do population and environmental elements interrelate? Also, they all suggested that Australia should have a population policy, something which I'll return to in a minute. There are a number of dimensions to the water population issue. The first of them relates to the total volume of water resources. Way back in the 1970s, Professor Holmes calculated that if you didn't take account of anything else, there's enough water in Australia for about 290 million people. However, I must stress that's not taking account of anything else, soils or anything else at all. 290 million people. 90 million of those in Tasmania, by the way. But if you relate it just to water. Very clearly, it's not just the amount of water, but it's where that water is. The spatial distribution of water is absolutely fundamental. But also, as we've seen, the temporal fluctuations in the availability of water within years, but also from season to season, and then, of course, long-term climate change. Henry Nix of the centre here in 1988 pointed to this very strong mismatch between population and water in Australia. In the far north, with 2% of the population, you get 52% of the runoff. A really striking difference. And in southern Australia, 82% of the population with only 27% of the runoff. But the key element, of course, is the one in the middle, While in the far north it only has 2% of the population, it also only has 4% of the arable land. So there is some reasoning behind that distribution. It's not quite as big a mismatch as it appears. Henry Nicks also, I thought, made quite a very prescient statement in suggesting that at that stage the southeastern part of the country had basically utilised all of its water resources, that it was pretty much being fully used up. And also he indicated that if climate change was to kick in, then there would be some serious consequences, and I think that's certainly been the case. Climate change undoubtedly is going to impact on population distribution in Australia. And I think this is really an area where we do need research which will try and follow through what some of those impacts are likely to be for population and settlement. And the one I want to particularly focus on, of course, is the water, the rainfall and runoff. And the two areas which are likely to be most affected by reduced rainfall and reduced runoff is the southeastern and southwestern corners of the continent. What the CSIRO has shown is that in Australia there are long-term trends of increase in rainfall, that's coloured in blue in this map, across the northern western part of the country. On the other hand, in the southern eastern part of the country and the southwest, there is a pattern of long-term decline in rainfall. And just if we take year 2006, what I've shown there in green is the parts of the country which got above average rainfall, in yellow the parts of the country which got below average rainfall, and white is average. Now, if we relate that to population, what do we see? 90% of Australians live in the areas which are experiencing a decline in rainfall, a long-term decline. And that is about 38% of the land area of the country. Only 3.2% of the population live in the areas which are experiencing an increase in rainfall, and that's actually experiencing a decline in population over the last intercensal period. Now, Australia's not alone in this. This is a similar pattern occurring in the United States. A Department of Agriculture report just earlier this year pointed to the fact that the impacts of climate change are going to be strikingly different between different parts of the United States. And most of the negative impacts in terms of reduced rainfall are going to occur in the west and the southwest. What they're predicting is a 20% decrease in rainfall by 2060. Now, that's a very significant part of the overall population of the country, with about 50 million people living in that region, and it has the highest population growth of any part of the United States. Now, how can we respond to the water dilemma in Australia? Well, one is to relocate, to change location, to shift. Secondly, to search for and develop new water supplies, or thirdly, to change our patterns of consumption. The relocation option is one which is getting a lot of play internationally. In the Intergovernmental Panel on the Intergovernmental Group on Climate Change, they suggest that migration may be one of the biggest impacts of climate change. And there's been this real explosion in what's been called interest in environmental refugees. I think probably to the detriment of looking at a whole pattern of possible adaptations to climate change. That the whole term of environmental refugee has taken on a new meaning. Undoubtedly, there are going to be people displaced by climate change, and Australia is going to have to, I believe, respond to the situations of places like Tuvalu and Kiribati, in terms of accepting migrants that are displaced. But it's unlikely that there'll be massive changes in population distribution in Australia. It may change where some growth occurs. It certainly may change where some irrigated agriculture actually is carried out in Australia. And water is going to be much more influential in the pattern of human settlement. What about the new supplies of water solution? In the 20th century, very definitely this was the approach which was used. We didn't just go out and get more water when there was an increasing demand for water through greater numbers and higher levels of consumption. And here I quote from the book which we're about to launch, that there was a belief that there was always going to be enough water to access. This approach has very much been the case in my state of South Australia, which I've been told from a child in school in South Australia is the driest state in the driest country in the world. I'm quoting here from Charles Fenner, who is Frank Fenner's father. Charles Fenner was a geographer who was one of the founders of the Department of Geography at the University of Adelaide. And he's written the most, he wrote the most fantastic article in the 1920s on the geography of South Australia. But what he wrote about really encapsulated the approach to water of the 20th century in South Australia. You can see here that he was very proud of the state's distribution system of water, which covered the whole state, and the growth of reservoirs and so on in the Adelaide Hills. And you can see from the tone of this quote from his work that all that has been done in the face of adverse conditions provide an excellent example of the way in which man, and presumably women as well, has in the first place adapted themselves to geographical conditions. So you get this idea of actually of a technological fix for meeting the increasing demands for water. Well, I've taken some of his diagrams and updated them, and in this one the black circles are reservoirs, and what you can see there in Adelaide is the growth of reservoirs up until the 1960s. In the late 1950s they connected a pipeline to the River Murray, and from there on the bulk of Adelaide's water was pumped out of the lower River Murray, and so we relied less and less on these reticulated supplies. But the whole issue is that the way in which you deal with water is through a technological fix of actually just getting new water into the system. Now, how realistic is it to do that in the future? It's really clear that in much of the area of Australia which is closely settled, that the water resources are very, very heavily used, or there's still much scope for capturing rainfall and being smarter in the way in which we deal with it, but there isn't a lot of new water around. Desalinisation plants are one, but there are plenty of issues about cost, about emissions from desalinisation plants, which do need to be looked at. And there's the issue of recycled water and all of the things which go along with that. But all of these things, or most of these things, do tend to imply this 19th century approach. And what might be, and I think is one of the really strong messages in this book, is that perhaps we have to start looking at the consumption side of the equation, as well as the supplies thing. And of course it varies a great deal between different types of use, and again from the book, some really striking differences between the states with respect to the way in which water is consumed within the house. And I think one of the really strong points and interesting parts of the book is the discussion of the consumption patterns of water in Australian cities. There are changing patterns of consumption both in agriculture, industry and in households. But the message of the book is one which I think is a very, very important one, and that is that we need to make the transition to sustainability. And there are a number of I think, very interesting and applicable policy relevant suggestions made in the book about the sorts of things that can be done to change the pattern of provision of water, the patterns of use of water for effluent, for wastage removal, but also changing the patterns of consumption. I think that many of the suggestions in the book are ones which are really ones which we do have to take on board in a very significant way in Australia. Stopping population growth also would have an impact in reducing the pressure on population. But as is usually the case with these sorts of silver bullet simplistic solutions, is not the answer to the current water problems which Australia faces. First of all, what it would do would be to draw attention away from what has to be a fundamental change in thinking about water in Australia. For so long, we've relied on the technological fix of just getting more water into the system rather than looking at the whole way in which the system is managed. But also, it ignores what the other effects of stopping population growth at this stage would be, and they would be very, very substantial and very negative for the whole economy and society, and I think also the environment in Australia if population growth were to cease. So we have a dilemma. On the one hand, the baby boom group do, I think, mean that we do need to continue population growth well into the future. Secondly, in looking at water and the environment, I think we do need to move towards a stable population as quickly as possible. So what we're facing, I think, then, is a very, very complex situation, one in which there has to be compromises, one in which there has to be trade-offs. I did have a bit more, but I've run way over time already, so I'll just conclude. What I believe we need to do is to cease regarding the environment and population as separate silos in the discourse in Australia, both in policy but also in terms of research. We need to look at these things together. And not just in the ways in which they interact, but in terms of what priorities we need to set and to deal with them together in deciding which way we should go in the future. Part of it, I believe, is that we do need a population policy. We do need to have a vision as to where our population should be going in terms of size, distribution and structure. And that needs to be done with full cognizance of environmental, social and economic implications. So I believe that we do need to move towards a situation of much more integration in both our research effort as well as in our policy determination effort. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.